Greetings, everyone, and welcome to City Lights Live, the online edition of the City Lights Booksellers and Publishers event calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight, City Lights celebrates the 50th anniversary of Project Censored, State of the Free Press. Project Censored is a nonprofit media watchdog organization whose goal is to educate the public about the importance of a genuinely free press for democratic self-government. Before we begin, as is customary, I would like to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush peoples. It is always an honor and a privilege to do so. So City Lights has had a decades-long relationship with Project Censored. It was originally founded at Sonoma State University in 1976 as a media research program by Carl Jensen, who was Associate Professor of Media Studies at Sonoma State College. The program focused on student media literacy and critical thinking skills. The project has since grown in scope and produces an annual book, a weekly radio program, and community outreach which focuses on issues of new censorship, propaganda, free speech, and media literacy. Past editions of the yearbook were published by Seven Stories Press. City Lights has had the great pleasure of hosting yearly events by Project Censored for many decades now. Tonight, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of their signature yearbook, State of the Free Press. It's published by the Censored Press. Joining us tonight are some of the movers and shakers of Project Censored. We will be joined by Mickey Huff, the director of Project Censored and president of the nonprofit Media Freedom Foundation. City Lights had the great pleasure of publishing the book he co-edited a few years back, United States of Distraction. Joining him tonight will also be his beloved colleagues, Andy Lee Roth, Mischa Geracoulis, and Shealeigh Voitl. Tonight's event will be moderated by Bill Budington. He is a longtime activist, cryptography enthusiast, and senior staff technologist on Electric Frontier Foundation's Public Interest Technology team. His research has been featured in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, and cited by U.S. Congress. So we're going to be posting links with which you may purchase copies of State of the Free Press 2026. We will also be posting links to the Project Censored website so you can learn more about their good work. And we'll also be making time for Q&A towards the end of the discussion. So post your questions in the chat function from where we will retrieve them. So join us now in offering a warm welcome to our friends at Project Censored. I will turn the mic over to Bill Budington to get the program rolling. Welcome to City Lights.
Thanks so much for that great introduction. I'm Bill Budington, and it's my privilege to be here as your moderator tonight, hosting this event and as a kind of a book launch for the State of the Free Press 2026 50th Anniversary Edition. Now, to quote Norman Stockwell, who is a publisher at The Progressive, there is no power for the people without journalism by and for the people. Assert Maya Schenwar and Lara Witt of the Movement Media Alliance and Project Censored State of the Free Press 2026, an apt summary of the new yearbook focus. 2026 yearbook celebrates Project Censored's 50th anniversary while tracking emerging threats to press freedom. So it is my great privilege to introduce, in reverse order, because why the heck not, our first panelist, Mischa Geracoulis, is the Outreach and Engagement Officer at Project Censored and production lead for the project's publishing imprint, The Censored Press. Contributor to Project Censored's State of the Free Press yearbook series, project judge, and author of Media Framing and the Destruction of Cultural Heritage by Routledge this year. Thanks for joining us, Mischa.
Thank you.
And our next panelist is Andy Lee Roth, is the editor-at-large for Project Censored and its publishing imprint, Censored Press, is co-editor of the project's State of the Free Press yearbook series, co-author of Media and Me, a guide to critical media literacy for young people. Roth began working with the project in 2006, and he served as the associate director from 2012 to 2024. During this time, he helped coordinate and expand the project's campus outreach program, which provides hands-on critical media training to students in colleges and universities throughout North America. Thanks for being here, Andy. And next on our panel is Shealeigh Voitl, Project Censored's associate director. She first began her research with the project in North Central College alongside Steve Maciek, co-authoring the Deja Vu News chapter in the State of the Free Press 2020 and 2023 and Top 25 chapter in 2023. In addition to her contributions as a recent co-editor of the yearbook series, worked with a campus affiliate program on censored press titles. Shealeigh helped develop the State of the Free Press 2024 teaching guide, the project Beyond Fact Checking, a teaching guide to the power of news frames, and the Project Censored show forthcoming segment, Frame Check. Her writing has also been featured in Truth Out, The Progressive, and Miss Magazine. She lives in Chicago. Thanks for joining us, Shealeigh.
Thanks so much, Bill.
And last but not least on our panel is Mickey Huff, Project Censored's third executive director, and is the president of the nonprofit Media Freedom Foundation. Huff joined Ithaca College in New York in the fall of 2024, where he now serves as distinguished director of the Park Center for Independent Media and professor of journalism. Since 2009, he has co-edited the annual volume Censored State of the Free Press 2025, co-edited with Shealeigh and Andy. The Media and Me, a guide to critical media literacy for young people, co-authored with Project Censored and the Media Revolution Collective, as well as Let's Agree to Disagree, a critical thinking guide to communication, conflict management, and critical media literacy by Routledge 2022. And the United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America, and what we can do about it. Published by our host tonight, City Lights, in 2019, and co-authored with Nolan Higdon. Thanks for being with us here, Mickey.
Thanks so much, Bill. Thanks to Peter and City Lights, and thanks for everybody for being here this evening.
Great. So I just wanted to ask how everyone's doing tonight, and then pass the mic over to Mickey.
Wonderful. Again, thanks so much, Bill. Thanks, Peter. Thanks to my wonderful colleagues and panelists here. We're going to start things off this evening. Each of us are going to talk for about 5 minutes each and just give some brief remarks about some of the things we wanted to focus on. And then we're going to engage in conversation with Bill and maybe Peter, and then of course all of you. So we're definitely looking forward to hearing from everybody here that's in the audience with us at City Lights this evening. It's an honor to be here once again back at City Lights. So I'm going to try to pack a little history in and just move along with some highlights. Project Censored is celebrating its 50th anniversary in 2026. Our book, Project Censored State of the Free Press 2026, just came out last month and is available at the link in the chat that Peter put in there. And you can find out more at projectcensored.org. So interestingly, our country finds itself as a precipice. This is the way that we started the foreword of the book this year, talking about how the United States teeters perilously due to rising economic inequality, domestic division on a host of issues. It kind of goes on. And the description could easily be taken for what's happening now, what's happening in the last year, the last several years, all of the kind of turmoils that we've been through. But interestingly, I was actually riffing on what was happening in the mid-1970s when the project was founded. Carl Jensen founded Project Censored in 1976 in the ashes of the Watergate scandal and Nixon presidency. And, Carl always had a passion for journalism and then went into advertising and marketing as a PR person. And the interesting reason is that when he was trying to be a journalist, he said there were too many restrictions and he felt kind of hypocritical about what he was doing. But when he went into PR and marketing, at least the advertising label was honest about what he was doing, and he was getting paid to be a propagandist. Anyway, he had some midlife changes that pointed his direction into higher education, and he went and got a PhD and started the communications program at Sonoma State. And, he really looked back at what was going on in media, and he started to become a media critic, fashioning his remarks about media, going back to people like Upton Sinclair and the Brass Check and George Seldes, In Fact, and of course, I.F. Stone, Izzy Stone, who was actually an admirer in the early days of Project Censored, along with people like Walter Cronkite. And Jensen asked this really interesting question at the time that was the genesis of the project. He was like, well, why was it that it took so long for the press to figure out Nixon was a criminal? when the independent press was talking about some of these things before the 72 election. And it took years for the Washington Post to get around to covering it. But when they finally did, there was sort of this revelation that, like, hey, yes, the media is powerful and can make a difference, but maybe the independent press is where a lot of the great stories are coming from. And so Carl wondered that if so many in the major press outlets at the time missed such a big story like Watergate, what else did they miss? And that was the genesis of Project Censored as a classroom-based activity where students would pore over independent media and take a look at what was important to them in our community, and then go and look at why the corporate media wasn't covering it. And so that's the genesis of Project Censored, and it became the beginning of what we would call a validated independent news research. And some of the folks in the corporate media at the time challenged Carl to say, well, we don't censor stories, we use news judgment. And so Carl said, okay, that's interesting, because the Nixon White House actually tried to censor Cronkite's coverage of Watergate, and he knew that there were problems, but he said, okay, I'll play nice. And so he started to look at what the media did cover. And in 1983, he coined the phrase junk food news, which is unfortunately alive and well and still very much with us today. And he said that the news media actually spent a lot of time covering junk and titillating stories and nonsense that kicked off important stories out of the news that the independent press would cover. So Carl was on to something, and he grew a national panel of judges with experts that ranged from Michael Parenti and Noam Chomsky to Howard Zinn and others. And the project created a top 10 list every year that Bruce Brugman at the San Francisco Bay Guardian used to publish. And the project took off and became a nationally known thing. To this day, coming into the 50th year, it's the longest contiguously existing media research project in the country, and we continue that tradition. 20 years later, Peter Phillips, a sociologist, took over, and by 2000 coined the term news abuse to talk about important news stories that the corporate media called basically were covering as propaganda. And so the project really started to look more specifically at, not just the stories that weren't covered, but how corporate media became an amazing arm of establishment propaganda. So over those years when Peter Phillips was in as the director, he started to play around with the idea of media democracy in action as a tagline. Carl's tagline was the news that didn't make the news. And Peter introduced this idea that really kind of moves toward where we've focused now on critical media literacy and even solutions journalism, where he was looking at who in the media was really making a difference. And so Project Censored really evolved from being a classroom exercise to being kind of a watchdog of here's stories you need to hear about, to significant media critics of here's where the media are going awry and here's where they're promoting propaganda. But here's also where things are going right and people are doing good things. And so the Media Democracy in Action tag really helped move us into the 2010s with our national radio program starting at KPFA. We gradually evolved and changed our definitions of censorship to look at not just state censorship, but corporate censorship, censorship by proxy, and big tech censorship. And that really led us to where we are with our affiliates program, working with a couple of dozen colleges and universities to really expand news media literacy. So anyway, I'm at my 5-minute mark, and so I don't want to hog up too much time, but I did want to at least give our audience a quick snapshot of where we've been and what we've been doing. And I'm definitely looking forward to getting into a lot more details. And also, I'm going to hand things over now to my colleague and associate director, Shealeigh Voitl, to talk to you about junk food news, infographics, and more things that we're doing at Project Censored. So thanks again, everybody, for being here this evening.
Thanks, Mickey, and thank you so much, City Lights again, and Bill and everyone for joining us tonight. Tonight, we're celebrating 50 years of Project Censored. And as the project looks to the future, we're finding new ways to reach people interested in critical media literacy, including increasingly through social media. Our social media manager, Reagan Haney, creates infographics for our various online platforms that highlight historical patterns of omission in corporate news, teach core news literacy skills, and champion local independent journalism. And it was this work, along with the growing significance of digital communities, that inspired Reagan and me to co-author a zine-style chapter in this year's book. The chapter focuses on how to interpret and verify online media messages, especially those presented as infographic or movement-based advocacy, and on how to become a responsible media maker by applying critical media literacy tools. The chapter explains how social media algorithms operate, and further, like how to work within those algorithms without compromising your mission. We talk about the importance of understanding how AI is used to deliberately mislead or provoke audiences, and how to spot those key red flags before impulsively sharing something to your followers. Responsible media usage today means fighting media fatigue and not becoming passive scrollers, but active investigators. And critical media literacy provides the foundational tools to slow down, question, and verify before reacting. It equips readers to recognize how their emotions are being targeted, how content is curated to shape their worldview, which traps people in these echo chambers, how their engagement patterns feed the very systems that influence them. And the chapter ultimately underscores that critical media literacy is no longer optional. It's a daily practice that empowers individuals to navigate online spaces with integrity and agency. And we're always navigating media messages now at a pace that makes it increasingly difficult to keep up. Mickey mentioned junk food news briefly, but in the junk food news chapter every year in State of the Free Press, we revisit the year's pop culture coverage to show what its volume and repetition reveal, especially when contrasted with limited attention given to issues that affect our daily lives. And those issues are often represented in our top censored stories in our first chapter, issues that concern environmental justice, labor rights, big tech, data privacy practices, all of which, affect us as people. And these parallels are not accidental, but insidiously serve corporate interess. And it's up to us to recognize these discrepancies and actively support independent media. And that's what this junk food chapter really hopes to do every year. So now I will turn it over to Andy to talk more about patterns of censorship over the years.
Thanks so much, Shealeigh. It's wonderful to celebrate Project Censored's 50th anniversary here with City Lights. Thanks to Peter and to Bill and everyone here this evening. This event is online, but tonight I'm thinking of 4 large portraits that distinguish the storefront of the City Lights bookshop in San Francisco, which deserves its global reputation as a center of free expression. Each of those portraits depict an author: Debbie Reese, Luis Rodriguez, Maya Kobabe, City Lights' own Allen Ginsberg, accompanied by a quotation that pertains to the power of books and reading to oppose censorship. The quotation attributed to Rodriguez asserts, "Censorship's against reality." For 50 years, Project Censored has championed press freedom, independent journalism, news literacy, in opposition to censorship and in support of democracy. Censorship is against reality. Rodriguez's insight resonates with a central theme from State of the Free Press 2026. The press, in the United States, around the world, is in a state of crisis, due in part to attacks on journalists, corporate control over much of what passes as news, and the public's lack of trust in journalism. So in our introduction to this year's yearbook, Mickey, Shealeigh, and I reflect on these challenges as a crisis in storytelling, a crisis that involves, on one hand, the omission or exclusion of certain types of stories by the establishment press. So establishment news is premised on narrow definitions of who and what count as newsworthy. And on the other hand, this storytelling crisis hinges on slant in what is covered and how important stories are framed. So some of what Mickey and Shealeigh talked about, junk food news, and Mickey mentioned about news abuse, for instance. So today, as much as ever in the history of US journalism, the profession faces a crisis in storytelling that is defined, I think, by a tendency to focus on dramatic events rather than systemic problems. That's the backdrop for 2 points I want to make now One, about what this book describes as chronic failures in news judgment and systemic gaps in coverage by the nation's establishment press. So the first point about that involves Carl Jensen, the founder of Project Censored's original definition of censorship, which emphasized its consequences. So here's a quote of something Carl wrote in the very first Project Censored yearbook about his definition, his working definition of censorship. Rather than starting with the obligation of an elite to protect the masses, Jensen wrote, my definition begins at the other end, with the failure of information to reach people, end of quote. From that perspective, a blockade on certain types of news need not be complete to be effective. So stories can be covered in inverted quotes by the establishment press without necessarily receiving the attention or context they deserve. And without informed citizens, democracy is precarious, as daily news headlines and people like historian Timothy Snyder remind us on the regular. This connects to my second point about the project's abiding effort to track not just individual instances of blockaded stories, but systemic patterns of omission. Chapter 1 of State of the Free Press 2026 presents 17 stories, first covered by independent journalists and news outlets, that never got the establishment coverage they deserved. And as a result of that, many people in the US are poorly informed about issues such as water scarcity threatening 27 million Americans, Meta's sweeping crackdown of Facebook and Instagram posts at Israel's request, and private companies reaping more than $100 million to, quote, sweep homeless camps in California and other states. The Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics exhorts journalists to seek the truth and report it while acting independently, transparently, and accountably. You could think of this in Luis Rodriguez's terms as a call to pay attention to reality rather than to deny it. So for 50 years now, Project Censored has served as a watchdog, sounding the alarm when the establishment press fails to live up to those standards. But this effort isn't simply critical, it's also affirmative. This year's report of undercovered stories and each of the 49 previous annual reports can also be read as a celebration of the power of independent journalism, independent media. Without intrepid reporting by countless truly independent journalists at outlets such as Truthout, Dropsite News, Just Security, and more than I could mention here, even if I continued all night, we'd be in the dark about these critical stories, and therefore less prepared to confront the realities they alert us to. With that point in mind, I want to conclude my opening remarks with two of my favorite quotes from this year's book. First, and Bill already mentioned this one, but it bears repeating, there's no power for people without journalism by and for the people. That's Maya Schenwar, the director of the Truthout Center for Grassroots Journalism, and her colleague Laura Witt, editor-in-chief at PRISM, from their article about the Movement Media Alliance in the yearbook chapter on media democracy in action that I think Mischa will talk more about. That basic point, no power for the people without journalism by and for the people, succinctly summarizes the main aims of Project Censored and the State of the Free Press 2026 yearbook. Second, drawing from the yearbook's introduction, which Mickey, Shealeigh, and I wrote, but really I have to confess here, this is Shealeigh's line, and I'm envious of that. I wish I had written this. If censorship today is more insidious than ever, then the resistance must be more interconnected, more imaginative, and more committed to collective truth-telling. I suppose it's that point, that call to action, that brings us all together here tonight. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to our conversation. And I'll turn it over now to Mischa.
Thank you. Wow, it's so nice to be here with all of you. I'm really honored. Thank you for hosting us, City Lights. I would like to share with you some information about the chapter that I have the privilege of curating, introducing this year and a few years previously. Thinking about it at this time, this precipice, as Mickey mentioned, we find ourselves, as 2025 is coming to a close. Project Censored, State of the Free Press 2026 delivers an unmistakable message. The United States is in constitutional crisis. Central to this crisis is the ongoing scapegoating of the press. Trump manufactured tropes such as the press are the enemy of the people are obviously overplayed, but continue to erode public trust in the press, and along with it, one of the most fundamental safeguards of democracy. Distrust of the media doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's part of a mediascape where power is dangerously monopolized. When 6 conglomerates control 90% of media in the United States, and the 5 tech giants dominating the digital infrastructure are Trump-allied media moguls, it's all too easy to silo attention and bend perception in ways that work against the public's best interest. Corporate gatekeeping of information is a threat to democratic society, endangering press freedom and every other constitutional and human right that depends on it. By contrast, media democracy, that is, media committed to democratic values, public service, journalistic ethics, and constitutional and human rights, including the right to a free press and the free flow of information, ensures that everyone, not just the powerful, is duly informed and has a say in shaping the narratives that drive our policies and laws. Media democracy checks power, challenges official storylines, and turns one-way top-down communication into dialogue and civic engagement. This is the very essence of media, the Media Democracy in Action chapter. Each year, this chapter features exemplars of media democracy in practice, and 2026 is no exception. Contributions this year include essays by Jody Rave Spotted Bear of Indigenous Media Freedom Alliance and by Lara Witt and Maya Schenwar of Movement Media Alliance, each illustrating media democracy in action as collective vigilance, information freedom, and accountability as a path to societal liberation. A democratic media system prioritizes the courage to ask hard questions, to challenge prevailing narratives, and inform the public of what's being done in their name. The essay by journalist and co-founder of Dropsite News, Ryan Grimm, describes how Dropsite's mission is exactly that. Founded in 2024 in response to ongoing disinformation campaigns, the silencing of journalists, and corporate media's uncritical coverage of government actions, Dropsite News affirms that uncompromising investigative reporting is public service. Media democracy also preserves historical memory and keeps important issues at the forefront of public consciousness. To this point is the essay by Joe Lara of Consortium News. For 3 decades, Consortium has provided hard-hitting journalism that holds power to account, blowing the cover on such government scandals as Iran-Contra, the CIA's Perception Management Program, and the fake weapons of mass destruction story spun to justify the Iraq invasion. On the theme of exposing government secrecy, the essay by Lauren Harper at the Freedom of the Press Foundation details how excessive government classification, surveillance, and data mining damage democratic society. When government keeps its citizens in the dark, confronting these systemic imbalances becomes all the more urgent. For almost 50 years, the work of Project Censored and every journalist ever featured in the State of the Free Press series has been a testament to the power of public interest journalism to balance the news and the system. If the American democratic experiment is to endure, it'll be thanks to a democratic media system that shines a light in dark places. The overarching theme of the yearbook series, and this chapter in particular, is that media democracy is not a pipe dream, but a roadmap to a more humane and just future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for those opening remarks, everyone. I remember in the lead up to the Iraq War, as you were mentioning, Judith Miller's columns in the New York Times, just kind of repeating the lies and the, public relations statements of the administration, just drumming up to war, and there not being that kind of critical lens that you were able to access if you looked for it. If you went out and looked for, say, Free Speech Radio News or Democracy Now, those were available, but it wasn't the default. It wasn't this, this kind of constant stream of news bits that were placed in front of people, and they were led to conclusions that they were meant to be led to. So thank you for those opening statements, everyone. And to jump right into the questions section. So Project Censored is celebrating its 50th anniversary. You were founded in 1976 by Carl Jensen, who was determined to fight censorship and make media literacy tools widely available. How have these threats to the press changed over the last half decade? Do you think the media is more or less free since then? As you look back, are you surprised at some of the historical turns?
Well, there's certainly a lot to address there, and we talk a lot about the assault on the knowledge industry in general. That's been ramped up to get into the Spinal Tap language. It's been turned up to 11. What we're seeing now, and we've been writing about that for quite some time. I think it's also the case that from Carl to Peter through us, we've maintained our definition of censorship as being a broad definition, not just something that fits from government, but we've been talking a lot more about what we call censorship by proxy. And some of the members of our team, including Andy and Shealeigh and others, actually had specific targeted grants from the Reynolds Journalism Institute to talk about algorithmic literacy and the challenge of algorithms. The shorter answer to the question of more or less, better, worse, it's kind of all over the place. But because we do have expanding independent media, if we have media literacy, critical media literacy education, people then are able to find, as you were talking, Bill, they are able to find those sources. And that was the project's mission all along, was to try to help people understand that there were more than 3 networks and more than the local newspaper. And of course, as cable expanded and the internet and everything else, as we got more and more sources to look at, what we saw is, well, more and more censorship, right? From now, we're seeing the call for censoring social media and censoring TikTok because young people are learning about the genocide in Gaza. Notice the problem isn't what's actually happening. The problem is people are finding out, right? And that's been one of the themes the project has had to address for years, is that we're really in favor of a widely informed public and we let the chips fall where they may. But again, at the risk of repetition, we think critical media literacy education is the main key to that, helping people understand and explore the vastness of independent media, to realize that corporate media is a propaganda arm of the establishment, as we're seeing now with the takeovers, with the attacks on even the establishment press and what's happening with Paramount, Netflix, Warner Brothers. Things are continuing to go in the direction that Ben Bigdikian and others warned. But that's why it's ever more important that we keep fighting back, calling this out, and doing everything we can to work together in solidarity with groups that are doing this, whether it's Freedom of the Press Foundation, Free Press, Electronic Frontier Foundation, Dropsite, a lot of people Mischa mentioned. That's really what we're trying to do in Movement Media Alliance, for example. We're trying to expand what we do at the project and get people to realize that it's not an either or prospect for the challenges we face. It's both and we really need to try to pool our resources. And with that, I'll hand things over to other members of the panel that I know have a lot to say.
I'll jump in there if Mischa and Shealeigh, I don't know, do you want to respond to the change over time question?
No, please, Andy.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would pick out I mean, there's all kinds of change. There are important continuities. I would pick out 2 things that I think are different now than when the project was founded. One is in the 70s, there was still certainly skepticism of journalism, but news avoidance, that's actually a term used in media studies now. News avoidance wasn't a phenomenon then the way it is now. And There are lots of reasons for the public avoiding news that partly hinge on trust in journalism, which is at an all-time low if we trust the polls and surveys and so forth. But there are more than it's more than a lack of trust that is leading to news avoidance. And I think one major development in the project's lifespan that is only growing momentum now is solutions journalism, as I think Mischa talked some about. And the idea in my intro to sociology courses, when I would get to the section of the course on media and news, my favorite part of the course, students would be honest with me about how little they paid attention to news. And my response, maybe this is too professorial, was maybe you're not listening to the most engaging kind of news for your concerns, for your interests. And I would always talk about solutions journalism and the Solutions Journalism Network and its fantastic work, including its solutions journalism story tracker, for instance. The other major change, I think, is something that Carl was ahead of his time in many ways. And we sometimes quip that Carl was doing media literacy with his students at Sonoma State College, later university, before there was a name for it. And now, I mean, the power, the consolidated power of corporate media has only increased since the project was founded, as Mischa was alluding to. But so has, where there's power, there's always resistance. And I think one form the resistance takes is an increased interest in media literacy, and especially critical media literacy, which takes into account, from my sociological perspective, power dynamics. And that's something that, when I was in high school, there were no media literacy courses at my relatively good public school. And now that's a much more standard thing. And we're finding, for instance, that the book we did for young people, not about young people, but for young people about media literacy, The Media and Me, is being picked up by a number of school districts across the country as if not a core text for students, certainly a teaching resource for their students. And so that's really encouraging. We're at a time where attacks on the press are at unprecedented levels, symbolic, legal, and physical attacks we're talking about. But there's also all this energy, right? It's you can, as you pressurize one area, force is generated in the opposite direction. And in this case, I think, in the direction of media democracy. So those are two crucial changes, I think, that you can kind of track over the 50 years, multiple decades of the project's history.
Thanks. That's a really important point. I think that I wanted to highlight too that you brought up is that reality is bleak in a lot of ways, and we see that a lot. We see that a lot of discouragement, but there are areas of hope and areas where we can see that there's pushback. There is resistance.
I mean, on that specific point, most of the time, when I'm making points, I'm trained as a social scientist, and when I'm making points about corporate news media, I try to have them be data-driven, evidence-based, et cetera, et cetera. This one is more speculative, but I think it goes to that question about despair. I think one of the purposes of corporate media and corporate news in particular is to disengage people. It's to convince people, and this is a corporate worldview, that the big decisions, the meaningful decisions, are made from a top-down position, and we're just there to accept the results and approve or disapprove in relatively meaningless ways. And I think the message from independent journalism is entirely different, because the people who are treated as newsworthy by independent journalism it's a much more inclusive definition. And I think, so for people who are discouraged by the news, I think it doesn't apply just to students in intro to sociology classes. If you're discouraged by the news, maybe you need to be looking at more independent journalism, which I'm sure many people tuning in tonight already are. And maybe specifically you need to be looking at solutions journalism, which Mischa could talk more about. But one of the key hallmarks to me of solutions journalism is it's not trite. It's about serious problems that communities are coming together to address. So it's not that, the cat was stuck in the tree and the firefighters came with the hook and ladder to rescue it. That's a good news story, but it's not a solution story, right? So yeah, I think despair is one of the challenges. We actually talk a fair amount in the introduction to this year's book about some of the themes in Rebecca Solnit's latest collection of essays. And one of the points she makes has to do specifically with news cycles that are so fast. The 24/7 news cycle is so fast that you can't recognize change, meaningful change in that time span. And so she talks about how the short-term view builds despair, right? So at Project Censored, we don't have a 24/7 news cycle. We sometimes quip that we work on a 52/12 news cycle, right? That by coming out with a book once a year, we're able to see patterns and recognize trends that are invisible in the tumult of the hot takes and 24/7 news cycle.
Before moving on to the next question, Mischa, Shealeigh, do you have anything to add for that kind of the flow of news and how it's changed over the last 50 years or the last even decade?
I guess I would just add, this is a little repetitive, but just the point that news deserts are an expanding phenomenon, and that speaks to the monopolization that Ben Bagdikian spoke about, 20 odd years ago, that is just in full force. Syndicated news, infotainment, and lack of local news. I saw in the chat that someone was asking about how local governments or county governments can support journalism. I mean, I just started thinking right away, bring back local newspaper, local reporting, even school newspapers can fill in those gaps.
Yeah.
Yeah. The local news has really kind of been a declining art and hopefully we'll see a real revival of that. Thank you for bringing that up. So for our next question, and we'll address the questions in the chat. As always, Project Censor's State of the Free Press includes a list of the most critical stories that corporate media underreported. First, please tell us how you chose those stories and then share a few from the list.
I'll take this one. So we this year are honoring our 50th cohort of students, and that includes more than 250 students from 8 colleges and universities that have worked on what we call the Validated Independent News Story Assignment alongside their faculty mentors. And what that means is they write a summary of a news story they identify as underreported by the corporate media. Students search for news stories and then they assess them for importance, timeliness, quality of sources, inadequate news coverage. Sometimes, these stories are covered by the corporate media, but they provide, a different angle than independent media, making them eligible for our list. And then me and Andy go through the process of vetting these stories to determine if in the time between submission prior to voting, anything has changed in terms of coverage by the corporate media. All of the stories are then shared with our judges to narrow them down. Project Censored interns then research these stories once more to make sure they're still eligible, and check to see if there's been any developments. And then finally, those stories are submitted to our judges again to determine sort of the order of our most censored stories list. And this year, we see similar patterns each year of stories covered. Environmental stories, I mentioned this earlier, environmental stories, labor rights, but big tech was well represented in our list this year as it was last year. Our number one story was based off reports by The Intercept and Common Dreams, which concerned ICE soliciting social media surveillance contracts to identify critics. According to the reports, ICE planned to hire private contractors to monitor and locate negative social media discussion about the federal agency. The call for proposal specified that for any social media content the contractors deemed hostile to ICE, the content creator's proclivity for violence should be assessed using social and behavioral sciences and psychological profiles. Our number 4 story was based on a report by Dropsite News, which found that Meta has acted on 94% of the Israeli government's requests to take down posts on Facebook and Instagram that are critical of Israel or even vaguely supportive of Palestinians. Dropsite News characterized Meta's response to the Israeli government's takedown request campaign, which resulted in an estimated 38.8 million posts being removed, banned, or suppressed as the largest mass censorship operation in modern history. And then finally, our number 6 story from Jacobin this year explored how Amazon and Walmart utilized workplace surveillance tech to intimidate warehouse workers and increase their productivity by listening in on workers' conversations, tracking customer interactions, and even tracking workers using a rating system that scores worker productivity and provides real-time feedback on individual workers' speed and efficiency. So those are just 3 of the stories represented in this year's list. I always find the big tech ones particularly chilling, but I'm sure my colleagues have others to share that they worked on.
Other panelists.
I think one of our other really powerful stories this year, I'm just getting my notes so I get the facts straight on this story, is about underreported, often deadly abuses of police authority. This is reporting by Sharon Zhang and Truthout and also Pascal Sabino in a joint publication from Bolts and Injustice Watch. And I'll give a very, very quick telegraphic summary of the 2 stories that compose this. The first is based on a report by Mapping Police Violence, which found that police killed at least 1,365 people in 2024, making it the deadliest year since Mapping Police Violence began tracking police killings in 2013. Nearly 65% of those documented killings were in response to 911 calls. I don't have the figure in front of me, but the number of investigations that led to sanctions against police officers for killings, especially ones that happened when police were reporting to a nonviolent offense, are minuscule. And that story is in our list, like all the stories in our list, because it was not well covered by the establishment press. The other component of that story, the Bolts and Injustice Watch, is Chicago focused. And it's about how routine police traffic stops, which often turn deadly, are not being documented in violation of Illinois state law. Some Bolts and Injustice Watch documented some 200,000 undocumented traffic stops by Chicago PD, according to an August 2024 investigation. And in effect, although many police departments across the country have outlawed, in the face of extreme public criticism, forms of stop and frisk, traffic stops in cities like Chicago often function as a new form of stop and frisk, where the motorists being targeted are predominantly black in predominantly black neighborhoods. And so there are deep concerns there with the figures. The Chicago Police Superintendent Larry Snelling was asserting that traffic stops were down by 87,000 after there was public outcry over this phenomenon. But of course, that figure, the police superintendent's figure, wasn't taking into account the 200,000 undocumented ones. And this is a classic case of, but for intrepid investigative journalists digging radio dispatch data in order to make the determination of the extent of these undocumented calls. So this is both a story that I think is shocking in its scope and its significance, but is also testament to the hard work, the tireless work that's required to break these kinds of stories. And when small organizationally and financially can manage that, it raises real questions about why the corporate news outlets, with their much bigger staffs and budgets, seem to be incapable of prosecuting these kinds of stories.
Thanks. I see some questions in the chat that are being responded to by our panelists. I did want
I'm
to,
trying to get on those as much as possible, Bill. Thanks.
yeah, no worries. I did want to raise some of these and read them out loud. This one by Sue, I think, is particularly good question. Can you please discuss how we move from learning about censorship, censored issues, etc., into action, where we take our expanded critical thinking skills into the world of our passions, our businesses, our teachers, problem solvers, lawyers, accountants, etc., need all those skills. Yeah.
Yeah, so I quickly answered that, and I referenced Nicholas Johnson, who was a former FCC commissioner. Some people may remember from the 60s and 70s. And Nick has actually been a Project Censored judge since the beginning. And so we still talk with Nick, and Nick's still there supporting us and casting his votes on the most censored stories of the year. And he wrote a book in the 2000s called Your Second Priority, which is kind of an important message I think that really lends itself to Sue's comment and question, is that regardless of our primary areas of interest, and so you mentioned some different things, how do we take critical thinking skills and media literacy skills into our own passions, business, teachers, problem solvers, lawyers, accountants, doctors, scientists, uh, laborers, workers, working people. You know, back 100 years ago, a lot of there were local papers for working people, and a lot of the labor unions had specific publications that addressed working class issues that the corporate media no longer talk about at all unless they frame them as a problem, right? Or it's someone else's problem. So we try to continuously tell people that critical media literacy is for everyone, and we try to get folks to meet folks where they are. And so we try to get people just asking folks questions like, well, when people say certain things about things that are happening, we ask questions. Where did you hear that? Why do you think that's true? What's the evidence behind it? And then we try to sneak in when we can, basic, fundamental questions about, well, who owns those outlets that you listen to? Or what are the conflicts of interest with the advertisers? And are they only talking to elite sources? Are they not talking to working people at all? What are the ideological biases of these publications? I mean, any of the publications that say they're objective, that should send red flags sky high
Totally.
because there are no real objective sources. So, Sue, I think that the other issue too is that we try to practice what we teach. And so we go out into communities and we do workshops, and we've donated literally thousands of books now to local schools, including the Media and Me and Media Literacy for Young People, where we really try to get people to understand that this is practical stuff that they can use in their everyday lives. And people have agency, and they can turn down the corporate media noise machine, and they can also maybe get off of screens long enough to, realize that there are other places to find and get information. And the deluge of the screen culture and the social media culture we're in now, human beings weren't wired to be constantly stimulated and paying attention to everything 24 hours a day. And I think we also need to be reminded in media literacy education that we need to slow down. You heard Andy say 5212, not 24/7. We need to resist the temptation to know everything all the time. We need to resist the temptation to have everything now. And we have to have patience and empathy. And we have to not only ask questions, but work with others with whom we may disagree to build bridges, not walls. And I think media literacy is a great vehicle to do that, no matter what walk of life we're in.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think too, like, Mickey covered a lot of this, but I was a student, learning about Project Censored for the first time. And I was a journalism student, and I thought I had all of the media literacy tools in my toolkit already, and, realized there was so much more beyond the surface of my news literacy skills in particular. And so I think, like, really the core of it is like once you start to notice these patterns and see these patterns within the media you're consuming, whether that's print media, broadcast media, social media, it starts to just become a daily practice, which I mentioned earlier. And I think that becomes like a natural part of our, way to process some of the, the media that we're consuming instead of just being passive observers. But yeah, I mean, I think, we talk about that in the graphic chapter about the importance of recognizing your responsibility as a media maker and not being super impulsive just because everybody else is sharing it, but understanding what's behind it, who's making it, why are they making it, are they making money from it, all kinds of different things. How are they framing it? What emotions are they kind of targeting? And those things just become, fortunately, like second nature. And I think really importantly now, as we're consuming social media all the time, like, I mean, Andy said, or sorry, Mickey said, we shouldn't be wanting to know everything all the time, but we have this device that allows us to kind of explore all the time. So it becomes now more important than ever to, slow down and really understand who's making these messages.
Yeah, I think of Mickey, who's a professor of history. Maybe you remember this is that the heterogeneous landscape of you, as you mentioned, kind of workers' newspapers. I think of in New York, the Freie Arbeiterstimme, which was a Yiddish newspaper that was published up into the 1970s that it was workers' news, right? And because of that heterogeneity, the wasn't all filtered through some small array of media profiteers.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, which goes back to 1919, Upton Sinclair and the brass check. I mentioned that earlier, and that really kind of kicked off a whole field of media criticism, which we need, and we need journalists covering that as a beat. I know Andy's talked about this before in some of our different events and things, is that one of the things we lack in some of our fourth estate is critical introspection about what they are or are not doing or covering, right? And now, since the establishment meat press itself is under assault, not just the indie press, it's an important time to, remind everybody that's a journalist that we need to stick together. Of course, I realize some people that call themselves journalists are actually paid propagandists, but putting that aside, or putting aside cynicism, I think that there's a lot to be said for sticking together and supporting the rights of people to know, and the rights of the public to really know and understand what's happening. And I don't think the corporate media has done a great job of that, frankly, which contributes to low public trust. But I think if people expand their horizons and read more and more about what's going on around them through the independent press, I think that people can realize that the ethos behind public interest journalism is still it's really alive and it's there, but it really needs public support. It needs our support, right? And yeah, absolutely. Ken Klippenstein has been doing a lot of really great work. And one of the things that's great about Project Censored is we get to experience and work with so many amazing people in the independent journalism world, and like reboost their signal, right? That's what we kind of do. Is we do our own criticism and some of our own research and our dispatches on media and politics and so forth. But we try to re-amplify and honor people that are doing the real, the yeoman's work, the independent journalism work. And that's actually also what I'm doing now at the Park Center with the annual Izzy Award named after I.F. Stone. So there's a lot of overlap in that. And quite frankly, even though we're in dire straits with the Fourth Estate, there is a lot of good work going on. And it's very important that we celebrate it and not tear it down.
Thank you. Yeah, well said. So, for our next question, how do the current levels of press freedom compare with last year?
Mhm.
How have the physical threats to journalism ramped up in the last year?
Well, quite significantly. So I'll just quickly say that the Press Freedom Index, the World Press Freedom Index, in the last 3 years, the United States has dropped 12 places. We're now 57th in press freedom in the United States. And I would tell people to check out the great work of the Freedom of the Press Foundation Press Freedom Tracker. We talk about it in the book all the time. Really check out Press Freedom Tracker. They have a great source on what's happening and where attacks on journalists and journalism are happening. Of course, the work of the Committee to Protect Journalists does fantastic work. So we like to refer people to those sources and those sites and think that they also deserve our support. But with that, I'll turn things over to others.
I mean, one of the things to keep in mind is that the most recent rankings that Mickey and Mischa have mentioned, I think, predate the inauguration of Trump and the Trump 2.0 presidency. So we haven't yet seen, um, you know, Reporters Without Borders, other groups that track press freedom here in the US and around the world. We haven't yet seen the full impact of the first cycle of Trump 2.0, but we can see it on the US press freedom tracker that Mickey mentioned. You can go there and you can look at all the meticulously documented incidents all time for this year, for the past 6 months. And you know, I think one of the profound misconceptions that a lot of people in the United States have is that because we have the First Amendment, we're exceptional on these matters. And when you look at the US Press Freedom Tracker, and when you follow people like the Committee to Protect Journalists and others, you quickly are disabused of that illusion, and you realize that journalists all the time in the US are putting their lives and their livelihoods on the line when they report on protests, when they report on immigration, and so forth. And that's not my opinion. Again, that's documented meticulously in the US Press Freedom Tracker database.
Yeah, Al Jazeera just reposted about Reporters Without Borders. Reporters Without Borders just did a study that the title of the report is Israel Remains the Leading Killer of Journalists in 2025, and it goes into the extraordinary attacks that they've been cataloging so far this year, and of course we'll see later in next spring what those results are. But you'll see I put it in the chat. And again, the number of reporters that have died in Gaza have been killed, I'm sorry, by IDF and by combat forces and war there, the onslaught that's taking place there. The number of reporters died actually has eclipsed, other major world wars. And that is a sobering statistic that is connected to real people. And we hear very little about that here in the United States through the corporate media. And the Trump administration is making it increasingly more difficult to talk about it. You heard about threats to nonprofits, threats to other types of reporting. We see threats against even the establishment media, where corporate media is bending the knee for FCC favoritism on mergers. The consequence of that is we're not going to hear these stories. The chilling effect is very real. Not only do we not see that reporting in corporate media, it's even the case that some independent media outlets are shying away from reporting about the sheer carnage and mayhem that's really unfolding in Gaza. And it's a very tragic story, a human rights failure of epic proportion, as well as, of course, an assault on press freedoms.
Just to
Absolutely.
tag on to that, if I may, the silencing of information in a different fashion is that with Trump 2.0, we see the marriage of big tech with government, and with that, the shutdown of the Freedom of Information Act, not actually, but the great limits to the information that's being released to reporters and to citizens who are seeking information. So that is one way that we're being, we're not getting the whole picture of what's going on. Also, the disappearance of data. Our data is being swept up by big tech and the government. And then historical data is being captured, history is being rewritten. And so these are ways that the government, in conjunction with big tech, is making it more difficult for any journalist to get the facts and report it out to the public. I'm sure Bill has a thing or two that he could say about that.
Yeah.
Just a few.
Yeah.
Yeah, at EFF, we definitely rely a lot on. So this relates to one of the questions in the chat. Harris asked about media funding. I'll get to that question in a moment, but we rely a lot on the reporting of independent journalists like 404 Media, who came out of Vice, and they are relying on subscription model to report on all of this data that's being siphoned off by people and via the advertising ecosystem, and use that as a tool that police have to have unprecedented levels of knowledge about people's real-time whereabouts even. So that is something that we find terrifying, and we fight back against at EFF for sure. And to kind of read that question out loud by Harris, what is the sustainable business model, well-grounded financing for meaningful, more than competent free press? Just reader subscriptions, corporate advertising, public funding?
The third of those is crucial, and we have about the least of it in the so-called developed world, less than $2 per capita, which is, many of the European countries are well over 100 per. And we just saw the collapse of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And as flawed as some of the NPR coverage or some PBS stuff is, we have to think about the other types of programming, educational programming, cultural programming. That's contributing extraordinarily to the spreading of news deserts and the collapse of education in media in that way. The corporate model
Collapse
has
of
proven.
civics.
Pardon, Mischa?
Collapse of civics.
Yeah, collapse of civic education. It's pretty extraordinary what's happened. The corporate model for funding has shown itself to be as corrupt as it's ever been. It doesn't work in the public interest. It, in fact, seems to drive people away from civic participation, or it seems to misdirect people to attack each other in terms of team red, team blue dynamics, which is terribly unfortunate because and Victor Pickard and others have written about this. This was one of Robert McChesney's big things. We need a robustly funded public media. Pickard and a couple of other media scholars just published a great study at the Roosevelt Institute that I'll pop in the chat that really looks at the challenges we face, the current crisis in journalism, and what we can do about it specifically if we have a robustly funded public media and education system. And of course, many of the nonprofits have tried and struggled to fill that gap, but now those are also under attack, and they're also fighting often for more groups are fighting for more limited resources. And so, unfortunately, because we are living within a capitalistic paradigm, those realities are stark and they're difficult to ignore. But I will post that. If you haven't read Victor's book, Democracy Without Journalism, from a few years ago, he's at UPenn Annenberg in Philadelphia. It's an extraordinary read that's very important. And it also gives people practical things to do. And it does talk about local victories from, New Jersey to parts of the rural South where there have been programs to hyperdrive, pump up, and fund local media outlets. You heard Mischa talk before about how college journalism programs, which are also struggling, but oftentimes it's the local college paper that's covering local news that just isn't being covered. So there are things that are happening. It's just we really need to find ways to pool the resources and support them where we can.
And I know that one of the is corporate advertising. Well, corporate advertising can be something that news outlets utilize, but it always comes at the price of you, the reader, right? And your data being siphoned off. So yeah, that's something that to keep in mind.
I think thematic to some of the issues we're talking about tonight, it's quite striking to me. If I asked how many news organizations in the United States have a dedicated press freedom beat, this goes back to something Mickey mentioned a while ago about how one of the kind of gaps in journalistic coverage is reporting about the conditions that make journalism possible in the first place. That's mostly done by media scholars and, sociologists who study news and folks like that, but it's not often reported by journalists themselves and therefore the public. So the answer, as best we know, to the question, how many news organizations in the US have a press freedom beat? The answer used to be one, and if the Trump administration has its way, it effectively now is and will continue to be zero. The only outlet that I know of that had a press freedom beat, where they had an actual press freedom editor and a press freedom staff covering the topic of press freedom as a news story in its own right, rather than a side angle of other stories, was the Voice of America. Now, we could get critical about the Voice of America as a propaganda arm of the US government, and that would be a conversation to have. But the fact of the matter is, right, the Voice of America had a press freedom staff. They, for a long time, had been focused on other countries and press freedom issues overseas. But more and more, that outlet had been covering press freedom restrictions by the US government in this country. And so I think, they were swept up in the Trump administration's general attack on a variety of US government sponsored media programs. But it's no coincidence to me that the one outlet in the country that had a press freedom beat is for right now out of operation. There's basically a pending lawsuit that the future of the Voice of America and that press freedom staff hangs in the balance. But those cases move slowly through the wheels of justice, especially when the government has been shut down as it was for so long.
Exactly. And let's, oh, sorry.
No, go on.
Wait, I was going to say, let's also remember that all of this was printed out for anybody who wanted to read in Project 2025. These plans were laid out, and the corporate press all but ignored it until, right before the elections. And we at Project Censored, we were talking about it. We and a handful of other independent press groups were talking about this. The writing was on the wall, and now we're faced with it.
We were called kooks and conspiracy theorists yet again because we were covering it on the radio and in our dispatches and other pieces that were like, look, these are the people that are doing it. They're gonna get into power and use the blueprint. This isn't fantasy. This is what they're going to do, and they're telling us. Sorry, Shealeigh, go ahead.
Oh no, that was what I was also going to say.
Yeah,
It was
Brendan
right in our
Carr.
face. Yeah, it was right in our face. I mean, we wrote a couple dispatches about it, and I know
Yeah.
Mickey, you talked about it often on the radio, and yeah, it's unfortunately, yeah, I think that is the purpose. Is it like it is supposed to come as a surprise to so many people because they weren't properly informed, and yeah, but there were people talking about it, not just us, obviously, but yeah, many independent journalists, and it's a shame.
Yeah, one journalistic outlet that I did want to highlight real quick. You mentioned Freedom of the Press Foundation, which is a organization, a nonprofit which tracks press freedoms. But a journalistic outfit that's publicly funded is ProPublica, right?
Yep,
And
absolutely.
ProPublica
One of our crucial sources on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Yep.
Whom the New York Times likes to partner with occasionally to bolster its reputation, but then conveniently forgets about when it's also convenient in the other direction.
right. And that brings us to our next question here. The book includes a chapter entitled Deja Vu News, which contributors Jaden Lawrence and Steve Mashek, I'm not sure.
Masek.
Update stories from earlier editions of the book. Can you tell us about a story from this chapter and how it has aged?
Yeah. The theme of this year's Deja Vu News chapter, which is an important feature, the basic idea is to go back and look and see if there have been two kinds of development. First, has there been development in the subject of the story itself? And then the second aspect of the deja vu analysis is to look at how has the coverage of that story changed in any significant way. And this year, Jaden Lawrence and Steve Masek focused the Deja Vu News chapter on attacks on journalism and free speech. And so I can just quickly kind of give a galloping overview of a couple of the stories that they looked at, which include the #1 story from the 2020 yearbook, the Justice Department's secret FISA rules for targeting journalists. FISA is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that has loopholes that allowed that basically actually, Bill, you're probably as versed on this as I am, that basically undermine the sanctity of the reporter-source relationship. Steve and Jaden also looked at the #2 story from the 2021 yearbook on how a Monsanto intelligence center was targeting activists and journalists. And they updated another story from the 2021 yearbook about how journalist, filmmaker, and Project Censored ally Abby Martin successfully challenged Georgia's BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction gag law at an academic conference where she was speaking in Georgia. So those 3 stories are kind of a look back. And for where we are in the evening, I will, unless there are further questions about specific ones, I won't try to go into more depth, but they're all examined meticulously in the Deja Vu chapter of this year's book.
And people can go online to projectcensored.org and check out the links that we've been putting in the chat, of course, but we have a whole link on Classroom, Project Censored in the Classroom. We have another link on yearbook chapters. So we actually have sections online for free that you can check out: junk food news, news abuse, media democracy in action, and Deja Vu news. So you can see other examples online.
Thanks so much. That's so great. So contributor John Collins from Weave News has a piece in this book in which he looks at Elise Stefanik's failed bid to become the ambassador to the United Nations. He shows how the media coverage surrounding her exemplified the distorted and biased reporting on Israel that the corporate media typically engages in. He uses a term coined by Carl Jensen to describe this: news abuse. So you talked about that a little bit before. First, please explain the concept of news abuse again, and then tell us how the coverage of Elise Stefanik illustrates it.
I can take the news abuse question in general. News abuse was a term coined by Peter Phillips, the project's second director in the early 2000s, to differentiate from junk food news, which was sensationalist, trivial, maybe nonsensical stories, or stories about pop culture or celebrities, superficial issues around that. News abuse is different. It takes stories that are about more serious subjects, but the way the corporate media handle it spins the story into a different direction that really prevents people from understanding the depth or complexity of it, and it makes it more a caricature or a propagandized version around a story. Unfortunately, what's been going on in the Middle East has given us plenty of fodder for the news abuse, because the way in which the corporate media in the United States have covered and framed that has been through a very biased lens. And that's something that has been pointed out over and over and over again. This year, John Collins from Weave News, another great independent media source, by the way, to check out. He basically is looking, and last year it was Robin Anderson, who was looking at some of the same things. It looks at how the news media frame those stories and make it very difficult for people to not only ask critical questions, but to even understand the complexity of what's actually happening on the ground in these places. And so that's about as much as I can probably get into it in detail given the time here. But news abuse itself literally is more of a form of propaganda. And both John and Robin in the last 2 years, again, I will say, unfortunately, are able to catalog time and time and time and time again where there's a specific frame that gives more credence to one side of an issue and another. And it really relates, and it goes back to some of the other earlier media critics that, when Project Censored was in its first decade or so, Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky wrote Manufacturing Consent and talked about the propaganda model. But one of the components that they talked about was the notion of worthy and unworthy victims. And one of the things that's looked at in these news abuse chapters is how some victims are seen in a certain way where we honor them and we mourn them, whereas other sides aren't even like statistics or numbers. They're completely dehumanized. And that's both what those folks are looking at to different degrees in the news abuse chapters. I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in. Or another question in the next 5 minutes we have left.
I think one of the easiest maybe ways to sharpen media literacy is to just kind of, I mean, of course, to check the independent media, but also just to look at news that is outside of the US bubble, right? So someone mentioned in the chat earlier, Al Jazeera English, just, watching the news story on another outlet, and then it's outside of the context of the typical U.S. Kind of sanitization and filtering of news. And one that I've been watching a little bit recently is CNA, which is out of Singapore, which is an English news station, which is based in Southeast Asia. So just kind of exploring what's out there, honestly, is a really great tool.
Absolutely. And this is a little different, but I would say too, avoid getting news through aggregate sites. Go to the independent news sources rather than relying on algorithms to pump stories your way.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. And it's something where we kind of have to go back in time a little ways, like, RSS feeds and subscribing to newsletters. The beauty of those, which, everyone says, oh, I don't need more email in my inbox, stuff like that. But the alternative is being fed filtered news by algorithms that are increasingly the new gatekeepers of news, right? The new inhuman gatekeepers of what news reaches us. And that's an absolutely crucial point.
Yeah, I put a link in the chat about our independent media sources. Project Censored has culled a long list, not exhaustive, but a long list of independent media sources. So, and I'm teaching classes on independent media at Ithaca College. And one of the questions I often get from students who are journalism majors are, what's independent media?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's an interesting question, but I mean, they want to know. And so, part of this work that we do at both Project Censored and what I'm doing at the Park Center for Independent Media, which is, basically we're two of the only organizations that really focus on independent media as an area of academic study that needs to get out to the public as part of critical news media literacy education. We really try to do it by example, try to show people what these outlets do, honor the work that they do. And so people can come to broaden their media habits and consciously start to go looking for information and news from these sources rather than think that they're going to get it from what's called news snacking, like the news will just find them somewhere on their algorithm feed or what have you. And that's not a really responsible way to be informed. And we don't want to finger wag at people, but we do suggest, hey, you've got some agency. Go out and look at some of these sources, try them on, share them with your friends and peer groups, right? And Andy just wrote in the chat, one of the groups we work with is Movement Media Alliance. That's a couple dozen organizations, kind of a rebooted media consortium, which was out of San Francisco years ago, that actually are doing incredible work. So check out the Movement Media Alliance work. Check out those sites and sources if you're unfamiliar with them. Check out the source that I listed for the Indymedia sites. And also check out the work we do with our IZZY winners at the Park Center for Independent Media.
Absolutely. And to mark on that, it's been 25 years since, or actually 26, but last year marked the 25-year anniversary of Indymedia, the Independent Media Center, indymedia.org, which was founded during the WTO protests in Seattle. So
yep.
It's a great landmark for that project and kind of started this whole internet independent media movement. Thank you for highlighting that.
Right on.
So how much time do we have for questions? Are we
Well, if I can chime in a little bit here, to City Lights, you folks are all like kind of superheroes. I'm often asked by friends, knowing as much as you know, how can you even get out of bed in the morning? It's because I bump into people like you. And there's a lot going on right now. And like you said, I mean, for those of you watching tonight, go out and search and be curious, because there is some very, very good work going on. And there is a younger generation which is really rising to the occasion right now. And I'm noticing it because I actually give talks, and a lot of it's on City Lights history, literary history of San Francisco, the politics associated with City Lights. And I see this very, very clearly, that there is definitely, a whole new current rising up politically in this country. And might not be very apparent, through the mainstream, but for those of us who are in contact with it on a regular basis, it's very palpable. It's very real. And I think Project Censored really helps support this kind of uprising. So I would say those of you who are watching, please do go to the links, check out the website. Please support Project Censored. They're doing really, really important work.
Well, that's very kind of you, Peter. We are such stalwart allies of you all at City Lights, and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, whom I had the pleasure of meeting and working with on a few occasions, is just testament to the whole ethos and spirit of everything you do. And I really feel like that we're kindred spirits in that regard. And one of the quotes that I often like to pull out, that Carl Jensen, again, you mentioned how do you get out of bed? How do you do the thing? We do the thing because I go and see my students, and we work with amazing people at the project, and we work in so many spaces with folks like you and Bill and EFF and Free Press and so many other groups. That's why and how, because there's a lot more people that care about these things than we often think. And it's important to go out and talk about it and be visible about it, so that other people who might not be in a position to say as much, or maybe feel more vulnerable, they know that they're not alone. And I think that's a key part of the message you just shared, Peter. Carl used to say that one of the roles education plays, and one of the reasons that even though media, he criticized it, he said media has the power to change and shape the world for good and for the better. And we can't cede that territory to profiteering corporations and warmongers. We have to be the media. We have to go and tell those hard stories. And Carl said, as far as education goes, journalism schools need to churn out more muckrakers and fewer buckrakers, because he thought that it really would make a difference. And we truly believe that.
Amen. Well, we have run out of time, and I'm so grateful to all of you for gracing our halls tonight, and a very, very hearty congratulations on the anniversary. And Bill, thank you so much for gracefully doing the honors. Mickey, Andy, Mischa, Shealeigh, thank you for all that you do. Please keep up the good work. I want to also remind everyone we have posted many links. I am actually happy to make a copy for anyone who emails me at peter@citylights.com. I will send you the entire chat in a file if you want to just kind of reference some of those links. There's some really great stuff there. And also how you can purchase State of the Free Press 2026. And also, please do check out the Censored website. And also want to mention, tonight's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture, and dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. And so, any last comments, anyone?
Thanks so much for having this great event, and thanks for City Lights for hosting it. Honored to be on moderating.
Yeah, thanks to you. Thanks to everybody for being here, and thanks to City Lights. If you are in San Francisco, definitely go to North Beach. Please check out that amazing historic space. Such great energy there. And again, just an honor to be here with everybody. So we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary all next year, all around the country. Come out and see us again. We'll definitely be doing a lot of things. If you need anything at all, please go to the website and contact us, Mickey@projectcensored.org. We would love to hear from you. And if you can do anything for us to get this critical media literacy curriculum out into your community, please let us know. We're happy to contribute what resources we have. We're in it together. And so with that spirit, let's go forward. Thanks again, everybody.